Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Creation Myths. I am really excited for this video because I think we finally can put a bow on the saga of Rob Stadler and separate ancestry. So this could be considered a follow-up to this video in which I talked about how Dr. Rob Stadler is currently less wrong in his argument against the Baum 2016 statistical evidence for common ancestry paper, but he was still wrong about it. And what followed the release of this video was a very, very long conversation in the comments of that video with Dr. Rob Stadler. And the conclusion of that conversation is that I now have an answer to what Dr. Stadler's argument is specifically, which I didn't have before. I understand exactly what it is he's saying. And folks, let me tell you, it is the worst possible argument he could have picked. So what we're going to do here is a little bit different from what I normally do, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that conversation. I'm going to put up on screen YouTube comments, and we're going to go through them. We're going to read through them together, and I'm going to kind of just guide the conversation. I'm going to narrate the conversation that I had with Dr. Rob Stadler. Now, I'm not showing you the whole thing because, let me tell you, this was a long conversation. It had various tangents, so there are comments on this video that are not relevant to the ultimate destination that we get to. So I'm not going to show all of them. I'm also not going to go through every word of every comment that I do show, because even within a single comment thread, there's kind of tangents and side conversations and things. So what I'm going to do is we're going to keep it focused. For each comment that I put on screen, some part of it is going to be highlighted. Those are the parts I'm going to focus on. I may even highlight more than one part, and we'll talk about them separately, depending on the length of the comment. And then if it's not highlighted, just don't worry about it. It's not relevant to kind of the straight line of the conversation that we ultimately end up having. So we get to the destination, and then you can trace that thread all the way back to the beginning, and that's what we're going to do here, and start from the beginning and work our way forward through these comments. So I think that pretty much explains what we're going to be doing here, and the whole point is to finally get to where this argument for separate ancestry / common design comes from. What ultimately is the argument against this 2016 paper that provides ironclad statistical evidence for common ancestry and against separate ancestry. One last note before we get into the comments themselves that we're going to go through. I suggested to Rob a number of times that it would be easier and extremely useful to have this conversation face-to-face, right? To talk on Zoom or on a stream or whatever and have this conversation. And that would minimize the misunderstandings and the talking past each other, right? It would allow us to clarify things in real time. Rob was not open to that, and that's fine, but I think that would have been beneficial, and I still think that would be a useful thing to do, and that invitation is still on the table, Rob, if you change your mind. So with that being said, let's walk through this conversation and see where we end up. This is going to be a lot, but it's going to be, I think, very illuminating. Let's get into it. So this is the comment we're going to start with. Rob Stadler wrote, "Dan, we first need to reach some clarity over my main point about the fundamental assumption in this paper. Baum et al. Assumed that under family-separate ancestry, the correlation structure in actual DNA could be no different than that which is produced by chance alone. What is your justification for this assumption?" We don't have to go through the rest. That's the big thing with this. So he's saying, basically, defend the methodology of this paper. And okay, I am happy to defend the methodology of this paper. My response to this claim is to say this is incorrect. They, the authors, were neutral on what that correlation structure would look like and used a probabilistic model, MCMC, Markov chain Monte Carlo, to sample the population distribution. Some members of that population would involve highly correlated family ancestors, and some would involve highly uncorrelated ancestors. The experimental design does not take a position on which are more valid, except to the degree that they relate to parsimony. I don't know what other words I should be using to get this across. We need to be clear on this. Do you or do you not understand that how what you're saying and what I'm saying are different? Right? So that's kind of the big thing here that I'm hoping Rob is going to respond to. Rob, I hope you don't mind me calling you Rob throughout this video. It's just faster than Dr. Stadler, and we've been calling each other by our first name. So, Rob, if you see this, I hope you don't mind, and you are, of course, welcome to call me Dan. So Rob responds, okay, for the sake of this discussion, let's say your description of Bohm's permutation methods is completely accurate. And the background for this is in the video where these comments are happening, the Dr. Stadler is less wrong but still wrong video. That's where I went through using the analogy with dealing cards. That's where I showed how the permutation method worked, which is different from how he described it. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of this comment because that first line there is really key, and we're not going to let that slide. So he says, for the sake of discussion, let's say your description is completely accurate. And I said, no, we're not going to play that game. My description is accurate. You dig into the paper, you go and look in what it says, and you actually have to go to the earlier paper that they cite for the methodology, but my description is accurate. That's not up for debate or something we can entertain for the sake of argument. We have to be on the same page in terms of the methodology before we can get to discussing the validity of the methodology. And this is something that, just to take a step back for a second, this is something that creationists like to do. They'll say, well, just for the sake of argument, let's say your description of the methods is right, or let's say your description of whatever is correct. And when the thing that they're permitting for the sake of argument is just a matter of factual accuracy. And no, don't let them slide on that. When a creationist tries to do this, do what I did. Say, no, we're not playing that game. Stop right now. We're going to agree on how this works before we move on to the question of validity. I'm going to try that for a bit here, and we're going to see how it goes. Okay, so the response to that from Rob was, you won't let me walk along with you and seek to understand your argument unless I concede to each of your points along the way. And again, that's the key line. The rest of what's on screen here doesn't matter because we're still having issues with just the basics of the methodology, right? When he says, unless I concede each of your points. And my response to this is accurately describing the methods is not conceding to anyone's points, right? But what I decide to do here is say this, we're not getting anywhere, basically. So we're just going to argue about the methods and the right words to describe those methods, and that's pointless. So I try to take kind of a different approach in the bottom half of this comment here, and this is going to kind of set up where the rest of this conversation goes. Basically, I tried plan A. Rob was not even able to agree on the basics of the methods, so now we're going to plan B, right? So what I said here is, but look, let me ask you a question I've been wanting to ask, because I think the answer will allow me to answer your question. What observed pattern of similarity would invalidate or be incompatible with a common design hypothesis? I'm asking because you said I simply want to understand why you think, etc. And I didn't quote the whole thing, but it was basically, I want to understand why you think this paper disproves separate ancestry. Well, if I know what would, for Rob, invalidate separate ancestry, then I can answer that question. So I said, I'm asking because you said, quote, and the answer to that question will help me address yours. Basically, I started this conversation trying to come in through the front door, right? Saying, okay, let's go step one, what were the methods? Step two, let's talk about their validity. And I'm going to walk through it step by step and explain why it invalidates separate ancestry. That didn't work. So saying, okay, let's do it through the back door. What to you would be incompatible with separate ancestry? And instead of going through the method step by step, all I could do is try to explain how the paper meets the standard that you're going to establish, right? But in order to do that, we have to first establish that standard of what is in bounds and out of bounds, right? And then I can show that the observations in the paper are out of bounds, right, for separate ancestry. That's the idea here. Rob responds with, you made a strong claim, this paper disproves separate ancestry. I'm seeking to understand your basis for this claim. And that's what I'm trying to get to if he would just answer the question that I end up asking over a dozen times over the course of this exchange. He goes on to say, now you are trying to deflect my question by changing the topic, asking about my common design hypothesis. That's not changing the topic. That's me attempting to answer your question, right? Because the paper is about separate ancestry. Rob's argument is saying, well, a common designer would design the separate ancestors with a certain pattern. So I'm saying, great, what pattern is not compatible with what you just described? And then I can explain how the paper arrives at that, right? So I'm not changing the topic. I don't know if this is tactics or genuine. I would like to believe it's genuine, but I'm not changing the topic. I'm trying to answer Rob's question here, and this is going to be a theme throughout this conversation of me trying to get Rob to provide information that will allow me to provide an answer. So let's continue. He ends this one with, your viewers should expect nothing less, and I respond with, I've answered this question to the satisfaction of my viewers, now I'm trying to address it for you. You, Dr. Stadler, want to understand why I say this paper disproves separate ancestry. I'm asking for your falsification criteria. That way, I can give you a clear, specific answer, and also so we plant the goalposts firmly in place beforehand. Which, as if you're familiar with how creationism goes, right, you give an answer and then all of a sudden that answer is not good enough. So I'm saying let's establish the criteria ahead of time so we don't have that happen. As I said, I am asking this question to be able to answer yours. So again, what specific observations would invalidate or are incompatible with your separate ancestry hypothesis? So already I've asked this question now a couple of times, and I'm going to keep asking it, and you're going to see it's going to take a really long time to get an answer. But eventually, we are going to get an answer. I promise you that's where this is going, everybody. So Dr. Stadler responds, you already planted the goalposts and have publicly announced your conclusion. I'm asking you to justify your goalposts and you are avoiding the question. So first, that's not what I was referring to when I said goalposts. I was referring to a moving the goalposts fallacy, right? Which is not a formal fallacy. Don't at me, philosophy people, I know. But what I was referring to was the moving the goalposts that creationists do. And this is not what that means, what Rob is saying here. This is not what we're referring to when it comes to goalposts, but that's not the point. I'm not avoiding the question. I'm trying to answer his question precisely. Okay, so I said, Rob, you're asking me to justify the conclusion. I'm asking you for the standard I need to meet to do that for you. Why can't you just answer the question? Observations XYZ would be incompatible with my common design hypothesis, and then I can try to explain how this paper meets whatever criteria you provide. So again, the point of this exercise is to answer the question you have asked. To do that, I need to know what would count for you. I just need to know where the line is, so then I can argue how the paper crosses the line. That's it. That's all I'm doing here, folks. And then from here, we're actually going to go to a different comment thread on the same video. So if you go to this video, you're not going to read all these comments that I'm showing you in order. It actually jumps around between a bunch of different threads and subthreads. So you just kind of have to deal with that. But I've put them together in the relevant order that the conversation happened. So you just follow along here and you're going to get the idea. But anyway, let me go to this next comment from Rob. And there's actually going to be a couple in a row because he responds to me and somebody else. And then I respond kind of together to that. So Rob says, your claim that this paper disproves separate ancestry is an incredible claim. You have much to defend, but you only offer diversions to my question about the underlying assumption. And he goes on to say, your question of why randomized permutations couldn't generate a highly correlated structure is moot if the underlying assumption is not justified. Okay, so now we're getting into something that's like specific. The shape of that distribution and how we arrive at that distribution. Is that distribution valid or not? So now we're maybe zooming in a little bit. We're honing in on actually an empirical question that we can address instead of vague concerns over straw man assumptions. So I think we're making a little bit of progress here. He also says, this is in response to Ninja Monkey Prime, he says, Rob says, the issue I have with the Baum et al. Paper is that the PTP test is applied in a new way in an effort to reject family separate ancestry, all based on a hidden assumption that if family separate ancestry were true, the actual phylogenetic tree from extant DNA should fit within the statistical distribution of lengths of trees obtained by random permutations without replacement of ancestral and derived states. My response to this was to again point out that the authors don't make the assumption that he says they're making. Right? They're not assuming that it must be random or uncorrelated or whatever. And I also note, if you don't plan to answer my very simple question that I've asked repeatedly, kindly say so, rather than just ignoring it. And I go on to say, once you do that, once you answer the question, I can explain exactly what the problem is because it's not that complicated, but I have to know what standard you're looking for. So again, I'm trying to convey to Rob here, once you answer my question about observations that would be incompatible with separate ancestry / common design, I can then explain why the paper meets those criteria, right? How the paper is able to demonstrate the standard that Rob is going to establish once he articulates that standard. That's what I'm trying to do here. So Rob responds, your question of why randomized permutations couldn't generate a highly correlated structure is a major source of our disconnect. Yes, that seems to be the problem, right? Why can't they get the correlated structure? That's the source of our disconnect. Okay, well, I'm happy to discuss it, but again, I'm not going to be, standing out on nothing. We need to be firmly grounded before we do that. So I respond, I would be happy to talk about this once you answer this question. What observations would be incompatible with your separate ancestry hypothesis? And specifically, I'm talking about what pattern of sequences, since we're talking about that first test from the Baum paper, which was about genome sequence comparison or gene sequence comparison. So it's all about what pattern or observation of sequence similarity or dissimilarity or hierarchical similarity or whatever would be incompatible with separate ancestry. That's what I'm trying to get Rob to articulate. What specific standard he says I need to meet. That's the thing. So we're going to jump to a different comment thread now, started by a different user, S-Bendit. He wrote, and Stadler is fundamentally misunderstanding Markov chain Monte Carlo. The entire point is to avoid sampling the entire probability space. And I was having the same thought here. This actually articulated something that I was thinking, that Rob several times seemed to imply that given the enormous number of possible tree lengths you're going to get through the permutation, the likelihood of sampling an optimally short one is extremely low, which is true. But that doesn't mean you can't include it in the distribution. The point is to sample the distribution to be able to determine what that distribution looks like without having to sample every point in it. Right? That's the point of the methodology. So I thought this comment was insightful because I had been thinking the same thing. So I responded, great point. In the comments of the video I'm responding to here, which is to say in the comments of one of the videos on James Torr's channels, I'm trying to get him to clarify. And one possibility is he fundamentally rejects MC-MC methods entirely. And if that's the case, there's nothing I can say to that. I'm not qualified to convince someone to accept basic math. And we're going to come back to that line. We're going to come back to that line. Now, before we move on from this, I just want to say this alludes to other conversations I was having on a different video with Rob. They're not relevant specifically to this line of reasoning that we're following here. So just, they're on another video. Don't worry about it. It's not specifically relevant, but we're having a number of overlapping conversations over the last, as I record this, over the last few weeks. So that's what this is referring to here. Now, Rob responded to this. He said, of course I don't reject MC-MC methods. What could make you think that? I can answer that question, but okay. My point is that the MC-MC methods are not doing what you have claimed, which is providing the best case scenario for family ancestry considering all of the possible trees or considering trees with high levels of correlation structure. So again, we have a fairly specific claim here. Right? This method in the Baum paper is flawed because the distribution is not considering all of the trees, or it's not considering trees with high levels of correlations or hierarchical similarities at the starting point, at those family ancestors. Okay, so that's a specific complaint. That's a specific critique about this methodology that we could potentially dive into. Okay, now the first thing I do in response is repeat my question again, and this is like the 6th or 7th or maybe even more time now. I don't even know how many times I asked this question at this point. I'm not showing all of them in this video, right? So I said, what observations are incompatible with your hypothesis? Just give an answer. But then, I want to clarify, so I understand you, it is your position that the distribution described in the paper does not include trees with highly correlated family ancestors. Yes? Because that's a very specific claim that we can evaluate, right? So that's what I want to check out. So Rob responds, yes, the distribution described in the paper would not have included trees with high levels of correlation structure. The distribution described in the paper would not have included trees with high levels of correlation structure. So now we have a specific claim that we can evaluate, and let me tell you, this specific claim is wrong. So I said, okay, well, that's just mathematically wrong. This falls under what I said above. I'm not qualified to convince someone to accept basic math. A Monte Carlo simulation will sample from the distribution of all possible tree lengths given separate ancestry. Some of those trees will be very short, and presumably involve highly correlated family ancestors. Others will be longer and probably involve highly uncorrelated family ancestors. The point is to find the range of possibilities to determine if a given observed tree length is an outlier of that distribution. If you disagree with that, then there's nothing I can say to convince you. It's just math. Right? So this is one of those things where, like, take it or leave it. Like, that's just how the math works. You sample from the distribution, you build the distribution, that's all possible tree lengths, and then evaluate if an observed tree length falls inside or outside of that distribution. That's it. That's it. There's nothing about that that precludes high levels of correlation in the family ancestors. There's literally nothing mathematically that prevents that from happening. All right, so I said the onus is on you, Rob, to demonstrate that that's the case rather than gesturing vaguely at strawman assumptions. And again, I repeated my question here. Just note, again, I'm repeating the question. This might have been like number 9 at this point, trying to get him to say, what's incompatible with your separate ancestry hypothesis? So Rob responds with a gigantic wall of text in a new comment thread. And for God's sake, don't try to read this. I'm going to zoom in on part of it. Don't try to read this. I just want to show you the whole comment so nobody thinks I'm like manipulating anything, right? So I'm going to zoom in on that middle part where the hyperlink is. So let me just zoom in on that and then we'll talk about it here. Okay, so Rob says, although the random permutation process does allow the extraordinarily unlikely possibility of producing a tree with high correlation, such as a tree from the actual extant DNA, trees with almost no correlation will vastly predominate, such that the mean and standard deviation that are estimated by MC simulation will only represent trees with minimal correlation. This is a simple fact of probability. So again, now we seem to have like a very specific critique where here's a technical issue with this statistical method. That is why this paper is invalid. And I responded with, okay, fair enough. That was a lot of text also that I responded with. Don't try to read that again. We're going to zoom in on basically the bottom half and we'll talk about it. Just don't try to read this whole thing. It's too small. It's too much. Here's what we're going to talk about. I wrote, the distribution represents all possible tree lengths achievable via family separate ancestry. Do you agree with that statement or not? If your answer is something like, no, it represents all possible tree lengths achievable through chance alone with family separate ancestry, you need to justify that difference mathematically. And here's the key part. What specific changes would you make to the methodology to make it a valid test to you? Rob, be specific. Please note that this is the same question I've been asking. To answer the question I just asked, you must articulate an observation that would be incompatible with your separate ancestry hypothesis. Do you see that? That's why I've been asking. Two ways of asking the same question. So now I give him an example, right? I say, for example, you might say, a valid comparison would be between the single shortest tree achievable via family separate ancestry, which would necessarily involve highly correlated family ancestors, calculated by determining the consensus sequence of each family rather than sampling and permuting one taxon from each, and the tree based on real data. They got a typo there. If the real tree is still shorter, that would show that common ancestry is required to achieve the observed level of parsimony. Baum et al. Didn't do this, so their test isn't valid, right? That part in the quotes in that third paragraph down, that's a hypothetical answer Rob could provide. And I say, can you provide an answer like that? That's all I'm looking for. Just like, here's a way to fix this. Here is Rob's response to my request for a specific way to correct that methodology. There's actually two really important things in this comment. We're going to follow one of them, and then I'm going to respond and Rob's going to respond, and then we're going to come back to this, and we're going to follow the other branch, which is actually the more important one. But I want to close the book on this first thing first. So right in the middle here, highlighted, he says, how could you randomly select from an astronomically high number of permutations to find representatives that have high levels of correlation? And this goes back to the proposed problem that Rob has with MC-MC methods. I respond, the whole point is you don't have to directly sample any specific tree length to construct the distribution. You don't have to sample any specific tree length to be able to calculate that tree length is part of the distribution. That's the whole point of how these methods work. That's it. Rob responds to that, sorry, I can't understand what you're saying here. And at this point, I'm out, right? I'm done, because this goes back to, I can't explain basic math. Like, I got nothing to say to this. Like, fine. You don't have to accept how an MC-MC method works. You don't have to accept that it's a valid way to sample from and characterize a distribution. I'm not going to argue that point. You don't want to accept it? Fine. Done. We can move on. What I am going to focus on here is the other thing that's going on. So I want to go back to this specific question right here from my longer comment. What specific changes would you make to the methodology to make it a valid test to you? Because again, Rob is actually articulating some specific critiques here. So I'm saying, okay, how would you fix the methodology? What would it have to look like? How would it have to work for you to accept it? And his response to that was really important and kind of got me thinking a bit. And it was, there is no way to change the methodology to make it right. There's no way to change the methodology to make it right. Rob goes on to say it is based on an inappropriate assumption that this estimated distribution constrains what separate ancestry could provide. The methods cannot be fixed. So I'm thinking, okay, let's investigate that. Let's pull at that thread a bit, because this is what's ultimately going to get us to the answer we've been looking for. Okay, so I said, okay, let me make sure I understand you. You're saying that this distribution specifically inappropriately constrains what separate ancestry could provide, or that separate ancestry / common design could in principle yield any level of parsimony, because these are two separate options. This distribution is wrong, but there could in principle be an accurate distribution. Or is it not possible to make a distribution because separate ancestry could theoretically yield any level of parsimony? There's no distribution that would be valid for the basis of comparison. Basically, the question here is whether or not this is a valid test at all. And this is what we're going to focus on for the rest here, because this is the key thing. Okay, so Rob's answer to that, which was an or, was yes. Yes, this distribution is assumed to be representative, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but it was an or. It was, is it this or is it that? And he says, yes. And he says, blah, blah, blah. It plants straw man goalposts, which is not how those words work together. That phrase doesn't make any sense. But whatever. The key thing here, as I've highlighted, is the yes. Because you may have noted that was not a yes or no question. So I point this out. You answered yes to an A or B. Can you please clarify? And Rob responded, I answered yes to A. The distribution, presumably he means this distribution, inappropriately constrains what separate ancestry could provide. Okay, so we have an answer. He's saying this distribution inappropriately constrains what separate ancestry could provide. So let's make sure that he's not saying B, right? So my next question is, thank you, now to B, is there, in principle, a level of parsimony that could not be achieved via separate ancestry / common design, whichever term you prefer, right? We've been kind of using both here, so we'll just try to be inclusive. Is there a level of parsimony that is out of reach for a common design hypothesis, right? That's the next thing we need to know, right? And I said, I want to be clear because you, Rob, said above, there is no way to change the methodology to make it right, which seems to imply that this type of comparison is not applicable to the question. It's not just about the parameters of the distribution, it's that this is the wrong way to approach this question in the first place. Is that an appropriate understanding of your point? So now we're getting there. We're getting there. So Rob says, I have already explained that the application of this data to attempt to exclude separate ancestry must rely on assumptions. You've already made that mistake, and you have repeatedly pressed me to make the same mistake. It won't work. That is not an answer to the question I asked. And if my voice sounds like I'm starting to get frustrated with the fact that Rob won't just answer the questions directly, it's because this was a frustrating conversation to have because Rob wouldn't just answer the questions directly. So I answered by saying, why can't you just answer the question? Is there a way to do this test to your satisfaction, or isn't there? In other words, you've said this particular distribution is invalid. Does there exist a distribution of tree lengths that would be valid for the purposes of this test or not? I'm asking because if I'm going to answer your question, I need to know if I should be defending the distribution or the test itself. I'm happy to do either, but I'd prefer to not waste my time doing the wrong one. So if the test is in principle valid, I'm trying to say here, if the test is valid in principle, but the problem is the distribution, I'm happy to defend the methodology and the distribution. But if the problem is the structure of the test, then I'd rather not waste my time on the specific methodology. I can just defend the logic of the test, right? Those are two separate things I can do, but I need to know more about Rob's position so I know which one I should be doing, and it's like pulling teeth trying to get a straight answer here. Rob responds, you need to defend both the distribution, i.e. why the MC methods provide the best case scenario for separate ancestry, and your acceptance of the fundamental assumption behind the test. Again, this is not an answer. So now I have a fairly long comment, and I'm going to focus on this highlighted bit here. But I'm going to read more of this because I want to just make clear exactly why I'm asking this question. I said to Rob, I'm trying to convey that there are two things I can do, and I want to make sure I'm doing the correct thing to address your request, which I understand to be, defend your claim that this paper disproves separate ancestry. I can justify the distribution itself, or I can justify the technique, but it's not worth it to do both. Jumping down, so I'm asking you to be clear. Is it in principle possible for this test to work? And then the highlighted part is the key thing here. So I'm asking you to please clearly say whether or not the comparison is in principle valid. The whole point of the PTP test, as applied, is that there is some threshold level of parsimony that is beyond the reach of separate ancestry / common design. Do you agree or disagree with that? This is the answer I need, just an agree or disagree. If the answer is agree, we can talk about the distribution and how it should be constructed, right? Agree that the test works, but disagree about the specifics. If the answer is disagree, we can talk about the basis for the test in the first place, but I have to know which conversation we should be having in order to defend my claim. That's the whole point. I need to know exactly what the problem is so then I can make the argument. And I want to zoom in on this just so we have it on screen all by itself. The whole point of the PTP test as applied is that there is some threshold level of parsimony that is beyond the reach of separate ancestry / common design. Do you agree or disagree with that? This is the answer I need. Justin, agree or disagree? And Rob responded, disagree. And that, folks, is the end of this debate. That is it. That's the end. Because what is Dr. Stadler disagreeing with here? He is disagreeing with the position that there is some threshold level of parsimony that is beyond the reach of separate ancestry / common design. There is no level of parsimony that is unachievable via separate ancestry. In other words, it is a completely untestable, unfalsifiable claim. That's what Rob Stadler has finally, at long last, admitted after literally weeks of back and forth and me asking over a dozen times, what are your falsification criteria? What observations are incompatible with your hypothesis? And in this final piece of the exchange right here, we have the answer. The answer is there are no observations that are incompatible with my hypothesis. Okay, that means it's not falsifiable. It's not testable. It's not science. Science is about hypothesis testing. I can't test your hypothesis, Rob. I can't test it. There's no observation that is contradictory or incompatible with your hypothesis. I can't test it. According to what you just said, what's on screen right now. Okay. So we're done. Now, I do want to note that I responded. I actually had a substantive answer and said, okay, let me explain why the test still works, but that's immaterial. It doesn't matter, right? I'm not even going to bother showing it. It totally doesn't matter. This is what matters right now, okay? Because what Rob is saying here is there's no extant pattern that could not be the result of creation, right? Separate ancestry, common design. Okay, but that's untestable. That is an untestable claim. It's just God can make it look any way he wants. There's no existing pattern that is out of bounds. And look, fair enough. You want to make that claim, be my guest. That's just last Thursdayism. That's all that is. You say God created everything a certain way 6,000 years ago, and that's, why we have whatever pattern we have today. Great. I say God created everything a certain way last week, and that's why everything looks the way it does today. How can you tell the difference between those two hypotheses? The answer is you can't. And that's what makes it completely out of bounds for any scientific investigation. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the end, folks. We don't have to dig any further into the nuts and bolts of this paper. And also, this is not just Rob that's doing this. At some point in here, Rebecca, Bread of Life, had one of her, give me evidence for evolution shows on her channel. Right? And Sal Cordova joined, and they talked about this exact thing. And Sal's point in this show was that God could make any pattern he wanted. It was exactly the same objection that Rob Stadler articulated it. You can't use an existing pattern to invalidate what God could have done because God could have made any pattern. Great. Totally cool with me. Completely untestable. Here's an example of just a short snippet from that conversation.
I wanted to ask Sal if he was aware of Dr. Dan's model that he was showing you last week about how nested hierarchies that we observe are not possible under common design.
I saw part of it. It can be possible. I mean, a creator can do anything. So, sorry.
But, okay, Dan's argument was that even if the creator created a perfect nested hierarchy at the start, it's the accumulation of mutations post-flood, post-fall, that would break that nested hierarchy.
A creator can do anything.
Okay,
you agree though that these mutations, okay, if you're accumulating random mutations, that you would not expect these mutations to be in the same places if they're accumulating independently along separate lineages that we're not sharing a common ancestor.
We don't know the mutation rates. This is to extrapolate what we observe now and then extrapolate in the past. And fundamentally, a creator can do anything. He can accelerate. A creator can do anything. He can accelerate. So I'm sorry.
No matter what mutation.
Can you mute your mic when you're not the one talking? Because there's a lot of feedback coming. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's very noisy on my end. Probably, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm saying regardless of the mutation rate, it doesn't matter what the mutation rate is. It's the fact that the mutations are shared in this same loci across branches that should be totally independent under common design.
I have a creator can do anything. I don't know how else to repeat it.
Fine, you want to make that claim? That's how you want to structure the argument? Be my guest. We're all done here. Earlier in this back and forth with Rob Stadler, Erica Gutsa-Gibbon and I did this long video diving into the methodology in the 2016 bomb paper in quite a bit of detail. And I think Erica summed it up really well at the end of this video when she basically said that to the extent this is a testable scientific model, it has been disproven. But creationists won't accept that because they'll add things onto it that make it non-scientific.
This paper disproves separate ancestry from a scientific perspective. Full stop. That's it. That's the ball game. If you want to appeal to all of this extra stuff, that's fine. If you want to sit around and try to poke holes in evolution, that's fine too. But as far as a scientific model of separate ancestry, it's DOA at present.
And that's exactly what we have seen here in this conversation with Dr. Rob Stadler. At the end of the day, this is just God can do whatever he wants to make things look the way they look. There's no observation that would make that impossible or would be incompatible with that theory of origins. And fair enough, but it's not science, it's not testable, it's not a hypothesis, and we don't have to spend any more time on it. So that's where we get to leave this one. Common design, for all the sophistication that creationists try to dress it up with, is just last Thursdayism, and it doesn't deserve any more attention than that. Call it out for what it is wherever you see it. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to like this video, comment, share, subscribe, and if you want to become a channel member, please consider doing that. You'll get immediate access to my pre-recorded videos instead of having to wait for the public releases. Thank you all again for being here, and as always, don't get fooled.